All right, the last thing I want to talk about this week is public order crime. Um, some places it's called some books like to call it consensual crime. The public likes to call it victimless crime. Um, and I would argue that in either case that it's not a good term. Public order crime is better. These are crimes that involve individuals who participate in certain behaviors willingly. So we're talking about drug use, which is I'm not going to discuss drug use this week. That's next week's topic. So we'll skip that to discuss that next week. But it also includes prostitution, gambling, and that sort of thing. There are those that argue that people ought to be able to engage in these behaviors in a democratic society. Um, the others argue that the state or the government should not be able to enforce morality. There's the argument against legislating morality. Well, I got news for folks. Laws that say thou shalt not kill legislate morality. It's all morality. Our morals tell us thou shalt not, not to steal. If we were to not legislate morality, we'd have to not legislate theft, not legislate murder. And so those arguments are full of bunk. Yes, that's my tip. That's my scholarly official term for it. Bunk. I don't think I can copyright that though. Public order crime, regardless of what it is, causes more harm to society than good. It increases the rate of police and official corruption. They lead offenders to commit other types of crime or open the door for or facilitate other crimes. They generate public disrespect for the law. They divert public health resources. They can create violations of civil liberties and indirectly, and sometimes directly, generate revenue for organized crime. And so these are certainly not they're not good, even though there's some of society that would argue that we should just not legislate these things. That prostitution is okay. Sure, yeah, that's working out so well for the people in Nevada. Let's talk about prostitution and pornography. Prostitution, let's understand that brothels. Y'all know what brothels are, right? Place where you go to visit with prostitutes. Yeah, visit, that's a good word. Very common in England and the United States. We didn't start really seeing any kind of moral crusade or effort to get rid of them until 1910 or so. And then since then, it's kind of been it's one of those areas, a moral issue, so to speak. It is a moral issue. I guess my sarcasm is the implication that other things are not moral issues. We didn't really see a crusade against it until about 1910. And then since then, most of the country has outlawed it. Again, there's still that holdout there in Nevada, which is something I've always found extremely ironic. That if you live in Nevada, you realize that prostitution is legal. It's regulated in almost every county of Nevada except for Clark County. Clark County happens to be the county Las Vegas is contained in, and so I find it fairly ironic that this nation's capital of sin draws the line at prostitution when all you have to do is drive 30 minutes out of the county and go straight to the Chicken Ranch or any other brothel that lives in the area. Let's see. Explaining prostitution. Well, let's see. Most prostitutes are women, though male prostitutes do exist. And most male prostitutes serve male clientele. There are some scholars that claim that prostitution is symbolic, that it is a social symbol for the way society victimizes women. It either way serves as a source of income for poor women, provides a sexual outlet for male clients. Neither of these things, while these things sound good on the surface, again, not good things. At least not a good way to get those things needs met. There is the debate that it ought to be legalized in places other than Nevada. They say it would reduce problems associated with with prostitution, such as assaults against prostitutes, robbery. The argument that comes out of Nevada is that the brothels are heavily regulated. The brothel prostitutes are tested by the Nevada Board of Health weekly for STDs. There are strict regulations about the use of prophylactics during the business transactions. And so there's arguments there that it's safer, it's better for the women, you get the mob out of it. But the other folks say, well, it involves consenting adults. Those of us that are against prostitution argue, one, that it is immoral. But even if we took our morality out of it, and our moral beliefs are, to me and a lot of folks, a strong enough reason to outlaw prostitution. But even if we were to set those things aside, a lot of the problems associated with it would continue. I was speaking to my organized crime class last week, and ironically, you'll be hearing this little spiel again in about 3 or 4 weeks in your organized crime class. Was talking about numbers running. Numbers running is essentially an organized crime, usually a local mafioso, local wise guy running his own little pick 3 lottery. And I won't go into all the details now, since you'll get them later in the organized crime class. But basically, numbers running is you get people to bet on a random 3-digit number, and then you do payouts for the winners. Very much just like Texas Pick 3. Almost no difference, except with the mob you get better odds. But the problem is, you think, okay, the mafia is making all this money with running numbers, and so, okay, through the state lotteries, let's legalize it. That'll get rid of the mob, or at least hurt the mob and hurt their interest in numbers running. We'll get rid of the numbers racket, and that didn't happen. The reality is, numbers running is still a profitable business for the mob. For a number of reasons, including the fact that you get better odds with the mob than you do with the state. Isn't that sad? You can bet on credit, and you can make your bets over the phone, and so it's more convenient, and you win more often with the mafia than you do the state when it comes to pick 3 lotto, anyway. And so it didn't go away. And so when you think about legalizing prostitution, the problems are not going to go away. There are still going to be streetwalkers. I mean, there are, if you go to Nevada, even outside the legal brothels, there are still prostitutes that work outside the legalized brothels. There's still always going to be people that are going to do it illegally to avoid taxes or for some other reason. It's just like, another example, another mafia-related example. Ending prohibition did not end bootlegging. People still smuggle booze to avoid the taxes. And so legalizing isn't going to solve that issue. And then there are feminist scholars that would argue, folks like Meta Chesney Lind, who you learned about earlier in the semester, that would argue that if you were to legalize prostitution, it would just open the doors for legalized exploitation and victimization of women. And so we're not making anything better. Related to prostitution is pornography. It is derived. The word pornography is, if you're interested at all, is derived from a Greek word, pornographos, literally meaning the writings of prostitutes. And governments, even our government, has attempted to ban or control its distribution. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court said pornography could be considered obscene or banned if the average person applying current community views would include the material appeal to lustful thoughts. If the work depicts sexual conduct in a patently offensive way, and the work taken as a whole lacked serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. The problem is, the Supreme Court says, well, who is the average person? Who decides it's patently offensive? And the Supreme Court loves the phrase evolving standards of decency. Well, our standard of decency in this country is evolving in the very wrong way. And so, if we're talking about the average person would conclude something was obscene, well, the average person is finding less and less obscene these days. In 1987, the court modified that ruling, noting that a work could be judged obscene and thus banned if a reasonable person applying a national standard would conclude the work lacked any social value. Regardless, pornography is so pervasive in our society. Apparently, a reasonable person in the United States does not find very much offensive, because there's a lot of porn out there that's not banned. Contemporary views of pornography claim that the public holds a number of different views about porn. One problem relates to how to define it. I mean, one Supreme Court justice said, "Well, I can't define it, but I know what it is when I see it." Great. Anytime we think about banning it, the pornographers all scream First Amendment, so we're being censored, and you're violating our First Amendment rights to put out smut. And well, they are, but I don't think it's a bad thing. Don't get me started on my views of the First Amendment. That you wouldn't like, as many of you would not like them. Feminists oppose pornography because it's a male-dominated industry, and it certainly is. While I understand there are magazines and products targeted is the word, marketed towards women in that industry. Most of it is targeted at men. There are problems with violent pornography. Things that depict violence against women certainly are illegal. But it is a question of censorship. What do we decide? Does it censor? When dealing with pornography, some argue that it leads to rape. Does pornography facilitate rape or sexual assault? The research is not silent, but it certainly is inconclusive. Individuals who commit sexual assault, your standard run-of-the-mill rapist, often does have violent pornography in his possession. But did the behavior come first, or did the viewing of the viewing of the pornography come first? Chicken and the egg. Let's see. Last thing for this video, I guess it's going to be short. Is we talk about gambling. It's another issue that is legal and growing in legality across the country. Certainly something that has a long history. There are any numbers of laws designed to regulate the conduct, particularly for the protection of the poor. Though we don't, considering the fact that we use a state lottery, we don't protect the poor very well. It is something that has become more and more socially acceptable and legal in the United States. I mean, when I was a kid, you wanted to gamble, you went to Vegas, or you went to Atlantic City. Today, if you want to gamble, you go to Vegas, Atlantic City. Here in Marshall, you just go across the border to Louisiana, to the casinos in Shreveport. You go a couple hours north to Oklahoma and hit the Indian casinos. Gambling's everywhere now. Religious groups tend to still continue to warn against it. Researchers argue that compulsive gambling has negative impacts on families, but it is something that is so pervasive that it's hard to ban. And I think we're going to hold off on too deep a discussion on gambling because all the really interesting and in-depth discussions of gambling will take place next semester. We do talk about organized crime, and we talk about its involvement in gambling. And I think next semester, those of you that are going to continue on in Flex 2 with me in the organized crime class will certainly see some of the dangers of gambling, even though it's been legalized. One of the things I was talking to class about last week or earlier this week is that even though gambling is legalized in many places in the United States, consumer or client gambling losses are in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and most of it is illegal gamblings. And so what do we do? How do we reduce these types of crimes? The reality is laws against public order crimes tend to not work. They may do more harm than good. Again, one of the things we'll talk about next semester in organized crime is that when you ban something like this that is somewhat popular with the public, it creates opportunity for organized crime. And organized crime groups like the Sicilian Mafia or other American mob groups or international groups, like Asian crime groups, European crime groups. When you ban a lot of these activities, all you're really doing is creating opportunity for an organized crime group to provide a service, so to speak, for the public that wants it, and create opportunities for corruption in government. And so, the laws against it don't work. Legalizing it, unfortunately, is not always a solution. Legalizing gambling, legalizing prostitution in Nevada has not worked. Still, once the organized crime groups have their foot in the door in these crimes, they're not letting go. They're still going to have a control over it. And I think we'll talk some next week also because next week's about drugs, and so a lot of my normal public order crime lectures talk about drugs. Well, I have that's next week. So short lectures this week. Maybe that's a good thing. Last week was a really long week for some of you folks, with having to get your papers finished. And I imagine if you're anything like me, the week after the days after a term paper is due, I don't want to study. I don't want to do anything. I want to goof off. And so watch the discussion video watch the thing on Bernie Madoff for the discussion video. Finish watching these if you haven't. Of course, this is the end of this, so I guess you've already watched these. Do your participation in the videos. Do your readings. Get ready for final exam. I mean, now that the term papers are done, you got 2 weeks of easy sailing, right? Well, except for next week with the final. At any rate, that's it for this week.